In May 1982, the quiet neighborhood of Mandarin in Jacksonville, Florida, was shattered by one of the most horrific crimes in the state's history. A pregnant mother, 37-year-old Nancy Wiler, and her two daughters, 9-year-old Christina and 5-year-old Catherine, were brutally murdered inside their own home. At first glance, it seemed like a home invasion gone terribly wrong. But what investigators uncovered would horrify even seasoned detectives. This wasn't just murder, it was a savage execution carried out with unrelenting cruelty. The killer? Alan Lee Davis, a career criminal out on parole, driven by perverse intent and explosive violence. What he did inside that house shocked the conscience of a nation and reignited fierce debate about justice, punishment, and humanity. To understand how this chilling saga of violence, outrage, and controversy unfolded, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a case that makes you question what justice truly looks like. Alan Lee Davis was born on July 20, 1944, in Millinocket, Maine, a small industrial town known more for its paper mills than for violent crime. From the very beginning, Davis's life was defined by instability, anger, and deep-seated emotional disturbances. Standing over 350 pounds as an adult and known by the nickname Tiny, his massive physical appearance contrasted with a childhood marked by isolation and a lack of emotional development. Very little is known about Davis's early childhood in detail, but court records and psychological assessments reveal a man who struggled from a young age with poor impulse control, learning difficulties, and a troubling fascination with violence. He dropped out of school early and bounced from job to job in the working-class trades, eventually becoming a welder. However, Davis was never able to maintain steady employment or relationships, often described as having a cold, detached demeanor and an inability to relate emotionally to others. By his early 20s, Davis was already navigating the criminal justice system. In 1965, at the age of 21, he was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter after causing a deadly car crash while under the influence of alcohol and medication. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, setting the tone for what would become a long and violent criminal record. After his release, Davis continued his descent into crime. In 1971, he was arrested again, this time for armed robbery and attempted robbery in the Jacksonville area. According to police reports, Davis used a firearm to rob a convenience store and attempted another robbery shortly after. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in state prison, but served only about 8 years before being paroled in 1981. During those 8 years behind bars, Davis showed no signs of rehabilitation. In fact, he was known to be aggressive, uncooperative, and manipulative. He did not engage in educational or vocational programs, and his prison records describe multiple incidents of threatening behavior toward both inmates and guards. Nevertheless, despite clear behavioral red flags, the system allowed him back onto the streets. And that decision would prove catastrophic. On the morning of May 11, 1982, the Wiler family home in the Mandarin neighborhood of Jacksonville, Florida, was filled with the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. Nancy Wiler, a 37-year-old mother of two, was 7 months pregnant with her third child. Her two daughters, Christina, age 9, and Catherine, just 5, were preparing for their day, blissfully unaware that evil was watching. Alan Lee Davis had already made up his mind. That morning, he armed himself with a .357 Magnum revolver, a powerful and deadly weapon. He had stalked the Wiler home before, learning their routines and plotting his approach. His intentions were as vile as they were clear. He admitted later that he had planned to sexually assault Christina, then kill her, her younger sister, and their mother to eliminate witnesses and then rob the house. He approached the Wiler residence, disguised his entry, and once inside, unleashed a level of violence so gruesome that it would haunt even veteran homicide investigators. Nancy Wiler was the first to confront Davis. Pregnant and unarmed, she was no match for his strength or brutality. According to the autopsy reports and police accounts, Davis bludgeoned her repeatedly in the face and head with the butt of his revolver. The beating was frenzied and merciless. She suffered at least 25 blunt force injuries, many to the mouth and skull, with enough force to crush facial bones. Her blood was later found splattered across multiple rooms. After disabling Nancy, Davis turned his attention to the children. Christina, the 9-year-old, tried to escape. She managed to get out of the house and ran for help, but Davis chased her down, catching her on the front lawn. He shot her once in the face, and as she lay wounded, he fired a second round directly into her head, killing her instantly. Neighbors would later report hearing 2 sharp gunshots in quick succession, followed by eerie silence. Davis then returned inside the house, where little Catherine, just 5 years old, had nowhere to run. What he did next was unspeakable. He shot Catherine in the chest, then as she lay bleeding, he beat her in the face and head with the same revolver used to kill her mother. The force of the attack shattered her facial bones and caused massive brain trauma. She died shortly after from a combination of gunshot and blunt force injuries. In under 20 minutes, Davis had wiped out an entire family, a pregnant mother and 2 young girls, in one of the most depraved and calculated home invasions Florida had ever seen. He didn't stop to show remorse. Instead, he calmly wiped down surfaces, attempted to remove evidence, and then fled the scene. He took with him a small amount of cash and valuables, fulfilling the last part of his sick agenda: robbery. When Nancy's husband, James Wiler, returned home later that day, he walked into a nightmare. The sight of his wife, his unborn child, and his 2 daughters, murdered in such a violent and intimate way, sent shockwaves not only through his own soul, but through the entire state. Police arrived and secured the crime scene. What they found was a blood-soaked trail of destruction, pools of blood in the hallway, a revolver imprint embedded in fractured skulls, and signs of a desperate struggle. Investigators quickly determined that the killings had been carried out with a level of rage and personal hatred rarely seen outside of domestic homicides. But Alan Lee Davis was not related to the Wilers. He was a stranger, driven not by revenge, but by a predatory lust, a thirst for control, and a violent past that had never truly been punished. When the news broke, the community of Jacksonville was shaken to its core. Parents clutched their children tighter, neighbors double-locked their doors, and Florida citizens began asking how a man with such a record had been paroled and allowed back into society. This was no random act of violence. It was premeditated, methodical, and merciless. And as investigators worked swiftly to identify and capture the man responsible, the name Alan Lee Davis would soon become infamous, not just for the cruelty of his crime, but for the way his story would end nearly 2 decades later. Following the horrific murders of Nancy Wiler, her 2 young daughters, and her unborn child, investigators moved swiftly to piece together the case that would bring Alan Lee Davis to justice, and it didn't take long. Davis had left behind a trail of evidence that, while not immediately obvious to the untrained eye, was damning in its totality. He was arrested not long after the crime, and soon, a full case was built around forensic findings, witness testimony, and Davis's own disturbing admissions. Police recovered the .357 Magnum revolver, which matched the shell casings and ballistic patterns found at the Wiler crime scene. Blood evidence and impact spatter found on Davis's clothing further connected him to the house. More chillingly, during a custodial interview following his arrest, Davis made partial confessions that hinted at his twisted motives, acknowledging that he had planned the attack, had sexual intentions toward the child victim, and had carried the weapon with full knowledge of what he intended to do. By the time his case went to trial in 1983, the courtroom was already under a spotlight. The Jacksonville community, still mourning and traumatized, demanded swift justice. The prosecution, led by the State Attorney's Office of Florida, laid out a brutal but fact-based timeline of events, calling crime scene investigators, forensic pathologists, and the victims' family members to the stand to build a comprehensive narrative of calculated, methodical slaughter. The prosecution argued that Davis's actions were not the result of impulse or mental instability, but rather the cold, deliberate choices of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to his prior convictions for armed robbery and manslaughter, highlighting that Davis was on active parole at the time of the murders, a key element that underscored the state's case for the death penalty. They further emphasized the uniquely cruel nature of the crime, the prolonged suffering of a pregnant woman who was beaten mercilessly, the deliberate killing of 2 children, one of whom was shot while fleeing, and the fact that Davis showed no signs of remorse before, during, or after the crime. The defense attempted to shift the narrative by introducing psychiatric evaluations that suggested Davis suffered from long-standing mental health disorders, including antisocial personality traits, impulse control disorders, and potential cognitive deficits resulting from head trauma or emotional neglect during childhood. They pleaded for the court to consider a life sentence, citing what they called his diminished emotional capacity and troubled upbringing. They argued that while the crimes were undeniably terrible, they were the product of a deeply broken individual who had never received proper mental health care or rehabilitation while in prison. But the jury was unconvinced. Over the course of several days, jurors heard exhaustive testimony about the crime scene, including photos and autopsy details that painted a horrifying picture of the violence inflicted on the Wiler family. The medical examiner testified that Nancy Wiler, though severely beaten, had likely remained conscious through much of the attack, a detail that brought several courtroom observers to tears. The testimony surrounding the deaths of the children, Christina and Catherine, was even more difficult to bear, and jurors sat stone-faced as experts described the extent of their injuries. After deliberating for just a few hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of armed robbery, 1 count of attempted sexual battery, and 1 count of burglary with assault. The evidence, both forensic and testimonial, had been overwhelming. But the verdict was only the beginning. The trial moved quickly into the penalty phase, where jurors had to decide whether Davis should spend the rest of his life behind bars or face execution. Prosecutors argued for death, citing a long list of aggravating factors: the murder of a child under 12, the murder of a pregnant woman, prior convictions of violence, and the commission of the crime during another felony, armed robbery and burglary. They insisted that these murders were not only deliberate but especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, a legal standard in Florida for capital punishment. The defense again appealed for mercy, asking the jury to consider Davis's lifelong psychological dysfunction, his low emotional intelligence, and his claimed remorse, though courtroom observers noted that Davis showed little emotion throughout the trial and never once addressed the family of his victims. Ultimately, the jury recommended the death penalty, and the presiding judge, after reviewing the findings, formally sentenced Alan Lee Davis to death by electrocution at Florida State Prison, a method still in legal use at the time. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, stated plainly that the cruelty of the murders and the utter disregard for human life left the court no alternative. Following his conviction and death sentence in 1983, Alan Lee Davis was transferred to Florida State Prison's death row, where he would spend the next 17 years challenging his sentence through a series of state and federal appeals. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, including his own partial confessions, the murder weapon in his possession, and the graphic forensic trail left at the scene, Davis's legal team launched a protracted legal battle, arguing that his trial had been flawed and that his execution would violate constitutional protections. From the beginning, Davis's appellate strategy revolved around claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, constitutional violations, and alleged due process errors. His attorneys argued that his original trial lawyer had failed to fully present mitigating evidence about Davis's mental health history, brain damage, and family dysfunction, factors that, they claimed, might have persuaded the jury to recommend life imprisonment rather than death. They also contended that crucial evidence regarding his psychological evaluations had either been overlooked or inadequately introduced during the penalty phase. In subsequent filings, Davis's lawyers attempted to raise doubts about his mental competency and intellectual capacity, citing old records of poor academic performance, signs of impulse control disorder, and antisocial traits consistent with severe personality dysfunction. At one point, his team even suggested that Davis's health, specifically his high blood pressure, morbid obesity, and history of epistaxis, nosebleeds, could pose medical risks that would render execution by electrocution cruel and unusual under the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. But at every level of review, both the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit repeatedly upheld his conviction and sentence. Judges emphasized that the evidence presented at trial had been overwhelming, the jury had received proper instructions, and Davis's legal representation had been constitutionally sufficient. As for the nature of the crime itself, appellate courts were unambiguous. Davis's acts were among the most egregious and brutal ever brought before the court. In 1999, after nearly 2 decades of failed appeals, Davis's legal options were finally exhausted. The U.S. Supreme Court, which had been petitioned to intervene, denied certiorari, effectively clearing the way for Florida to proceed with the execution. But the controversy surrounding Davis didn't end with the courts. As his execution date approached, public attention shifted toward Florida's chosen method of capital punishment, electrocution. At the time, Florida was one of the few states that still used the electric chair as its primary method of execution. The device, nicknamed Old Sparky, had long been the subject of debate among legal scholars, human rights organizations, and members of the public who questioned whether it constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Constitution. Critics cited numerous past executions that had gone wrong, where inmates had caught fire, experienced prolonged convulsions, or suffered burns so severe that it called into question the state's protocols and humanity. Davis's scheduled execution reignited that debate with ferocity. Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, and several other human rights organizations submitted formal complaints and public statements urging then-Governor Jeb Bush to grant a stay of execution, arguing that Davis's execution could potentially be inhumane and that Florida should adopt lethal injection as the default method of execution, following the example of other states. Protests were held outside Florida State Prison in the days leading up to the scheduled date, with some activists holding up signs bearing photos of past botched executions and urging compassion, even for a man whose crimes were deeply reviled. Despite the uproar, Governor Bush and the Florida Clemency Board stood firm. In a written statement, the governor's office emphasized that Davis's crimes had been exceptionally horrific, and that the state had followed every legal step in accordance with due process. The families of the victims also issued public remarks, expressing relief that the legal process was nearing its end and asserting that true justice could only be served if the sentence was carried out. In his final clemency hearing, Davis himself appeared emotionless and detached. He made no apology to the Wiler family, did not express remorse, and offered no final plea for mercy. That silence only fueled public anger among those who viewed him as unrepentant and monstrous. Florida corrections officials confirmed that Old Sparky had been inspected and tested in preparation for the execution. The device, built of oak and equipped with leather straps, copperhead electrodes and a sponge soaked in saline, had not been used since 1997, and technicians were under pressure to ensure that it would perform without failure. Despite the preparations, many feared that Davis's health complications, especially his large body mass, hypertension and fragile blood vessels, could lead to an execution that would appear grotesque or inhumane to observers. But the courts ruled that the risks did not meet the threshold for cruel and unusual, and emphasized that Davis himself had the option to choose lethal injection, which he declined. Under Florida law, inmates sentenced before 2000 had the right to choose their execution method. Davis chose the electric chair. As the final date approached, media attention intensified. Some newspapers and TV outlets began revisiting the crime in lurid detail, while others questioned the morality of the death penalty itself. A series of editorials appeared across Florida, some condemning the use of electrocution as an outdated and barbaric practice, while others defended it as a necessary tool of justice for crimes as vicious as Davis's. On the morning of July 8, 1999, inside Florida State Prison in Rayford, final preparations were underway for what would become one of the most scrutinized and controversial executions in modern U.S. history. After nearly 17 years on death row, Allen Lee Davis, the man who had brutally murdered a pregnant woman and her 2 daughters, was about to be executed in the state's electric chair, a device that had come to symbolize a fading but still potent form of justice. Just after sunrise, prison staff carried out the final steps of protocol. Davis was moved from his holding cell to the death watch area, where he was offered the opportunity to make a final statement and to partake in a last meal. According to official reports from the Florida Department of Corrections, Davis requested an indulgent and unusually large final meal. 1 1-pound lobster tail, 6 ounces of fried clams, 1/2 pound of fried shrimp, 1/2 loaf of garlic bread, fried potatoes, and a 32-ounce A&W root beer. He consumed most of the meal in silence. Though Davis had remained largely stoic and unemotional throughout his incarceration, reporters present at the time noted that in his final hours, he appeared tense but not panicked. He declined a spiritual advisor. He did not speak to the families of the victims. And when asked if he had any last words, his response was brief and unsettling. "I'd rather be fishing." Just minutes later, Davis was escorted into the execution chamber, a small, sterile room surrounded by glass for the official witnesses. At the center of the room stood Old Sparky, Florida's notorious electric chair, constructed from oak and metal with thick leather restraints for the arms, legs, chest, and head. Davis, weighing over 350 pounds, was slowly guided into the seat by guards, who then began securing the straps one by one. Technicians attached a copper electrode cap to his shaved scalp, beneath which was placed a saline-soaked sponge to improve conductivity. Another electrode was attached to his right leg. These devices would soon deliver 2,300 volts of electrical current in rapid succession, designed to disrupt the heart and nervous system almost instantly. At 7:10 a.m., the warden gave the final signal. A switch was flipped, and thousands of volts surged through Davis's body in the first of 3 cycles. Within moments, something was clearly wrong. Witnesses, including journalists, attorneys, and a representative from the governor's office, reported that Davis's face immediately contorted, and blood began pouring from his nose. His chest heaved visibly, and he remained rigid for several seconds before his body slumped. Some observers claimed to see burn marks and smoke rising from the electrode sites, including his head and leg. One newspaper reporter described the scene as gruesome, disturbing and unforgettable. Photographs taken shortly after the execution confirmed the presence of facial burns, discoloration, and a large streak of blood running from Davis's nose down to his chest. Images that would later be leaked and published by several media outlets, igniting a nationwide debate. Florida prison officials were quick to respond. In a press briefing later that day, Corrections Secretary Michael Moore stated that the blood was the result of a known medical condition. Davis had suffered from frequent nosebleeds, often caused by high blood pressure and blood-thinning medication. Moore insisted that the electric chair had functioned exactly as designed and that Davis had lost consciousness within seconds, with death pronounced at 7:15 a.m. Still, the visual impact of the execution was immediate and powerful. Images of Davis's post-mortem appearance began circulating in newspapers and television broadcasts across the country. Public outcry surged, not over the guilt of Alan Lee Davis, which was never in dispute, but over the method of his execution. Editorial boards, human rights groups, and lawmakers from both political parties began questioning whether electrocution had any place in a modern justice system. Civil liberties advocates argued that the graphic nature of Davis's execution, particularly the bleeding, physical trauma, and visible suffering, even if brief, constituted a violation of the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Florida's method of capital punishment was suddenly under national and even international scrutiny. In the wake of the incident, legal and ethical pressure intensified. Just months later, the Florida Supreme Court, in response to growing concerns, approved the use of lethal injection as the state's new primary method of execution. From that point forward, inmates in Florida could choose between the electric chair and lethal injection, but electrocution would no longer be mandatory. And as of today, Alan Lee Davis remains the last person ever executed in Florida's electric chair. But beyond the controversy, for many, the focus remained on the crimes themselves, on the pain and loss endured by the Wiler family, and on the lives of 3 innocent people who never saw justice served in time to save them. Though Alan Lee Davis's final minutes stirred national debate and political fallout, there is no debate about the legacy he left behind. His name will forever be tied to brutality, legal transformation, and a state grappling with the balance between justice and humanity. What do you think? Was justice truly served in the case of Alan Lee Davis? Or did the method of his execution cross a moral line? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss another case that challenges what justice truly means.